This episode, I'm joined once again by Steve Knepper to discuss Byung-Chul Han's book, The Palliative Society, Pain Today. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep it running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So Steve Knepper, once again, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Always a pleasure to be here, James. Thanks for having me on again.
After the popularity of the previous episode on your recent Byung-Chul Han reader that we recorded with co-author Rob Wiley, we decided to discuss a specific Han work. We had a lot to choose from, but Han as a writer tends to, have very thematically focused and honed in on books, whether it's Zen or whatever it might be. His books are very focused. And this one, The Palliative Society, Pain Today, is basically a very short 76-page book released in translation in 2021 by Palliative. It's a book on pain. It's a book to really begin this discussion. And it's how Han begins the book. And we both went off and reread this other work that he's referring to, even though it doesn't really play a big role. The book Han's book, The Palliative Society, in a sense, centers around a quote from Ernst Jünger, which is found on his book on pain, which is, "Tell me your relation to pain, and I will tell you who you are!" Exclamation point. So he's demanding that, and I think Jünger is also. I think Jünger would be fine with me saying. You could expand that quotation by saying, "Tell me society's relationship to pain, and I'll tell you what society is. Tell me X's relationship to pain, and I will tell you what X is." But you were telling me just before we started recording that this book hasn't got too much attention.
Yeah, I feel like it hasn't got as much attention as some of other recent Han's books, like The Disappearance of Rituals, Vita Contemplativa. So I feel like this one didn't get quite as much attention, but I think it's really interesting. And there are some new twists in here from Han that you won't really find in any of his other books.
Okay. So, I mean, let's just Han is dealing with something normally called that his argument, which I don't think he is defending in any sort of empirical specific terms. He's not pulling out some peer-reviewed paper, and as you were also saying before we started recording, Han does lay his cards on the table. So he's saying something that, in a sense, and I think he does this a lot in his books. He says something that he feels he doesn't actually really need to argue for, in a sense of like, here are my reasons, but something that we as a reader would intuitively agree with after he's sort of, or during his, let's say, articulation of his points. And so, ultimately he's saying our society today is characterized by a universal algophobia, that is a generalized fear of pain. And ultimately, this is why I say I don't think he really defends the point by saying, we interviewed 5,000 people and they're scared of pain. I think he's just saying, look, if you want to try to deny that, then try to deny that. I imagine you did as well. It's like immediately I'm like, yeah, no, I agree with that. So how, off the back of the Jünger quote as well, I guess do you agree with Han just off the basis of that first comment, but also what do you think our relationship to pain is? How is that?
Yeah, that's a lot in there and some really good starting points. I think that from Jünger, the two things Han draws, and I think basically goes in a very different direction beyond these. One is that I do think that looking at how pain is approached in a society tells us something important about that society, how pain is imagined, how it's treated, how people are encouraged to live with it or not. All of these are kind of important windows into that society generally. And I think that's something that he draws from Jünger and he agrees with. The other thing I think that he draws from Jünger and agrees with is that pain can't be eliminated, right? That there's this cunning of pain, right? That pain can be minimized perhaps, but the idea that we can have a totally pain-free life is a fantasy. So I think that where he goes from there to critique the present day, it's not necessarily at all. I don't think Han wants to romanticize pain, or fetishize pain. I don't think it's a sadomasochistic tract at all. But I think that what he sees in contemporary societies in the West is really this idea that pain is just to be eliminated, and kind of this belief that pain can be eliminated. And minimized is a good thing, right? Trying to treat horrible chronic pains is a good thing. But if pain can't be fully eliminated, if that's an impossibility, and your society's only reaction to pain is eliminate it, then you run into a real contradiction. And I think he sees our society as very bad at dealing with unavoidable pain, helping people through unavoidable pain, giving them the means to deal with unavoidable pain, accompanying them through that. I think he sees these as real failures in contemporary society that go back to this idea that pain should either be eliminated, or if we can't eliminate it, we just can't kind of process it. We don't know how to deal with that. So I think that's part of it. The only other thing I might add is I think he also thinks that there are forms of pain which are not at all bad, are useful and important. Once we get beyond the pains of diseases and things like that, the vulnerability and struggle and pain that comes along with any real relationship with another person, especially a romantic relationship. I think he thinks that our pain aversion has led us to be very guarded in those relationships. And therefore, maybe we save ourselves some pain, but we also cut ourselves off from all kinds of meaning and depth. We conflate kind of the simplest form of happiness with meaning. And I think he thinks that's a mistake. And, one of the more provocative chapters, I hope we circle around it, is sort of pain and thinking, which is great for this podcast because I think you modeled this, right? That thinking involves contradiction and struggling with ideas and wrestling with them. And that's where sort of growth and development happens. So there's no real thinking without pain.
There's sort of two stages there, because much in the same way that when we think about pain as a modern society, it's the same, let's say, erroneous way we think about happiness. It's very single-minded. You say pain, people think, banged my knee, stubbed my toe, stomach ache, headache, whatever it might be. It's physical bodily pain, which is kind of, it's correct on the biological level, of course, but Hahn is immediately expanding that out. But I want to begin, and I guess it's just more of a comment on what you said there, on this notion of, because I think it's sort of progressive and it begins to build a myth, which gets in, but that doesn't mean it's true, which is, if you begin from this premise that pain is bad, which then, of course, that is true, it's painful. That then sort of evolves into we should eliminate it, which of course is good. But then from that it seems this further progression of it should always be eliminated and therefore any pain shouldn't be. And I think that's the line where it begins to turn into not pain happens sometimes and we'll try to get rid of it, into pain happens and it's actually a glitch, like a malfunction, and an error of existence that should be in pain. And it's intriguing, actually, a lot of the language. I've been thinking about this recently, just from one of the suttas, actually, I've been reading from the Buddha, with this emphasis that one word we might throw at pain is, oh my God, this is unnatural, right? This is something that kind of shouldn't be, but actually, something that Buddhism emphasizes, and, Hahn, I imagine, would very well know this with his influence from Zen, is that, well, actually, no, illness and bodily pain, as per where it's coming from, is natural. It's completely natural phenomenon because it's all happening within the same bounds. It's not something artificial in that way. Maybe you could make if you got shot or something, you might be able to say, maybe. But it's still natural within the bounds of the body. And so we end up in this world of things, I think, being an error. And this, to me, I want to throw so that's something that we can maybe bring back in of, something in the world is wrong when we're in pain. But this, I think, for Hahn is this, what his major sort of the crisis of this is, as you've hinted towards, is he moves away from bodily pain quite quickly into, he moves directly into criticism. He says criticism is pain, right? Like people being critiqued, people having friction. If we were to disagree, there's like there's a pain, there's a tension. And it reminds me of something that John Michael Greer said in one of our chats about like how to describe modern society, and he said that we want to live in that episode of like Star Trek where like you put your head in the thing and it reads exactly the food that you want, which ultimately is a world without any friction, without like it's a world with no criticism, no friction, no tension. Like we're never going to have an awkward moment. We're never going to have this thing of like, maybe I should be looking at Steve right now. Maybe I should be looking at myself. I don't know. This is like tension and anxiety, right? We're never going to have any of that. But Greer says this is ultimately like living in a world where absolutely everything is made of crystalline ice. So all you're doing is slipping around. You can't get any anchor. You can't, there's nothing to hold on to, and so you slip everywhere. And Hahn, I think, is gesturing towards this, that modern society is this transforming into a frictionless space. So it's not you. I think the difference is that when you stop criticizing people, when you stop having these disagreements that they're painful, you don't enter into a new form of like tolerance or agreement. Everything just becomes less experiential, everything becomes more neutral.
Yeah, there's a lot in there too. And I think you laid your finger on one of the major through lines in Hahn's thought. And he would shake his head in agreement with that Greer quote, because he thinks that one of the things that mark at least the developed countries of the world is this increasing positivity of life, right? That we do want things to be frictionless. You know, the internet certainly has facilitated this. We want the answer now. We want to find that movie and watch it now, that song now. We want an answer into our work email absolutely now. More, faster, without any resistance. But also in things like our friendships, our relationships. We don't want disagreements, right? We want we want sort of a perfectly frictionless existence. All kinds of things might be understandable about that, but the two major points that Hahn makes is, one, when you come to pain, as you said earlier, you just can't eliminate it entirely. Another phrase he draws from Junger, and again, I don't want to give the sense that he's more aligned with that Junger track than he really is, because I think the differences are very, very profound. But this idea of the cunning of pain, that pain has a way of sort of coming back in new forms in human life. So with positivity, he emphasizes the ideas of burnout, right? And certain forms of anxiety and restlessness that sort of come in sort of this overstimulation. But then also, just sort of old-fashioned pain that comes from suffering, disease, aging. That kind of stuff can only be minimized so much. It comes and gets us all. And, a society that's obsessed with only the positivity and the frictionless then has trouble just computing that, let alone sort of approaching it in healthy ways. So I think that's an important piece of this. The other thing that Hahn is very good on, though sometimes maybe he should spell that out more than he does, is this idea there's some forms of negativity we definitely don't want to return to. To bring up another one of your former guests, an episode I really enjoyed was about with Kevin Hart, when he was talking about his autobiography and how much kind of bullying and kind of violence he just grew up in sort of post-war England. Hahn doesn't want to go back to that, right? Hahn doesn't think it'd be better if kids were bullied or something like that. Not at all. There are forms of negativity that you don't really want to encounter and you do want to minimize. But then there are forms of negativity that are very healthy. So disagreement, right? So Hahn thinks that our kind of allergy to disagreement, or our tendency to move it all online, maybe behind pseudonyms or just into these encounters that you can dive in and dive back out, it increases polarization, and it actually destroys the kind of solidarity that can come from having a real honest back and forth uncomfortable conversation with someone, where you come out from the other side maybe not agreeing, but you've had that dialectical back and forth, and there's a kind of bond that can form in that, right? That's productive and important to civil society. So Yeah, and another form of negativity comes back to a lot is this idea that a real friendship, a real relationship with a significant other, you're gonna be sad when they're sick. They're going to disappoint you. There are going to be times when it kind of sucks. And all of that is part of it and important to it, and actually kind of can grow you and grow the relationship and adds meaning if it doesn't always add in the moment thin kind of hedonistic happiness.
Well, without fully abiding by the Nietzsche quote that we both said we weren't too keen on, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Whatever doesn't push you doesn't make you stronger. I mean, maybe it would be a way to reframe that that's a bit more moderate. So, I mean, to use a very quick biological analogy, if you want to grow your muscles, technically you actually have to destroy them, and then they go, okay, I need to be a bit stronger now because we're doing that now. So in terms of the sort of the friendships or the criticism or the relationships we've been talking about, it seems that actually language and comfort have two distinct languages actually, and one is one that will push you, and one that has friction and something that will cause things to break and cause you to grow because you have to in the moment. And the other one is of comfort, and you end up staying within that. And actually, I wanted to bring in another Junger quote, which I'll have to paraphrase, and I'm not sure if it's in on pain. I couldn't find it. It's one of my favorites of his because I think he's being very tongue-in-cheek. But he's talking about crowds, and he's talking about in a way, the comfort and ease and the way in which people suddenly enter into this distinct comfort of being able to do certain things within a crowd. And then he talks about the crowd for about a page, and then he suddenly just turns on a dime and says, you should see what the M65 machine gun does to the crowd. And he's not referring to killing them. He's just on about this sort of, I guess, an existential moment of like, oh God, what have I been doing? And watching them disperse, because ultimately this is a relationship to, Thanos, to death, and also to the fear of pain as well. So he's saying like, really this is, I guess in philosophical lingo, right? It's an intrusion of the real into that comfort that you had. So as you were talking about, when we don't have this relationship with pain, and I think anyone listening who's had, and I'm sure you've also had moments where suddenly you're in your comfortable life, and either you get news about someone that you love, or news about a health problem that you have, and all of a sudden you're like, well, death and all the things that are very important are very, very, very real now. And all of a sudden that book I was working on, that book I was reading that was important 10 minutes ago is now basically like useless. It's nothing. But modern society is moving in such a way that language is becoming, I would even go so far as to say, unspokenly banned, right? Like we don't want that. We don't talk about death, don't talk about pain, but they're mandatory. So we aren't growing. We aren't having these moments. We aren't having the machine gun moment. We've found a way to avoid it.
Yeah, and there's some connections here to the conversation you and I had with Gabriel about Gabriel Marcel a little while ago. And actually, I just received a advanced copy of Han's newest book that's coming out in, I think, December in English translation. It's called The Spirit of Hope. And that's the first place that I know of that he extensively interacts with Marcel. And I do think they have a lot of commonalities. But on this question of pain, Marcel might say something like, we tend to reduce pain just to a problem that can be solved, especially with medicine, right? But pain also has this dimension where it's a mystery. It keeps coming back, right? And death is inevitable. And with mysteries, Marcel says, we can't solve them the same way we would a problem. We can't just solve it with a pill. We've got to kind of navigate it and manage it with wisdom and kind of live through it and live toward it. And I think that's a big part of what Han's critiquing too, that can we accompany people through pain? Can we accompany them towards death? A certain biological reductionism is a target of both Marcel and Han. I may have brought this anecdote up in the Marcel episode, but I think it's worth repeating. My friend, a really great philosopher, Gordon Marino, has a little book. He'd be a great guest sometime. He has a little book called The Existentialist Survival Guide. And Marino's this really just tremendously interesting individual. He was a pro boxer. He still does a lot of boxing coaching and writing about boxing. but he's a philosophy professor too. And he's one of these philosophy professors where the stakes are always clear, because he credits discovering a book of Kierkegaard on the way into a psychoanalysis session with saving his life, right? He was about ready to kill himself, and he found this book, and it kind of pulled him back from the ledge, he said. But he recounts a discussion with a student that he had, where the student was saying that, yeah, I'm just really struggling mentally. I'm really deeply depressed. I've got to get my medicine figured out. There's some sort of imbalance in my brain I need to solve. And Marino is sort of this old school psychoanalysis kind of guy, existential psychoanalysis kind of guy. And he's like, well, is anything else going on in your life? And he said, well, yeah, if I remember right, my mother died like 3 weeks ago. And it's not that there can't be a biological component to depression or anxiety, of course. But Marino's point is, to reduce the loss of your mother to a chemical imbalance, it's not the kid's fault. There's something wrong in our society where that's where you go, right? And we have lost a lot of ways of mourning, right? We give people a couple days off work and then kind of expect things to go back to normal. We don't have these, drawn out patterns of mourning. We, for a lot of people, they don't know how to have a funeral that becomes meaningful for a loved one. There are all these
a funeral
ways.
Is an error, right?
Yeah,
like a funeral shouldn't be these days. You just want to get it done.
And again, there's all these ways in which these are inevitabilities, that you're going to lose loved ones, that you're going to have to face your own death. And you can't just handle them as a problem. You need these practices, these techniques of wisdom, this more holistic way of approaching it. And I think Hahn thinks that's one thing that's been lost in our relationship to pain.
I think it is relevant, actually, because it's a qualitative, quantitative distinction. And it's, I'm getting a bit more comfortable throwing in my own views on these podcasts, but the story you tell there of the, this chemical imbalance thing, there is nothing I loathe more than the reduction of human emotions and human experience to this idea of, it's like basically like what a 13-year-old would say when they go through their first breakup, right? Well, love's just chemicals in the brain. Okay, shut. Like, if you're 13, fine. If you're 13, I get it. That's your way of coping with your little summer love. But there's nothing I loathe more, even if you are a materialist, of reducing experiences and emotions, negative or positive, and notice that no one reduces their positive experiences to chemicals in the brain. I'm having a great time. Oh, hang on, wait. This is just chemicals. I better stop, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's always the negatives. Because ultimately, in the sentence itself is proof that is not the case, right? To say love is chemicals in the brain is to say that there's two things going on there. So you have the chemicals in the brain that may very well be the structure and fundamental cause of the thing that you call love. But it's, as far as I'm concerned, and Michel Serres writes about this, what you're doing in that moment is conflating like the chemical structure of what makes a good cup of coffee with the taste of the cup of coffee, which makes absolutely no sense. And it's a juvenile way of getting through life. And anyone who I think tries to defend that sincerely would have to try to defend the comment that like, why do you love your dog? Oh, well, if you zoom into my brain, there's, when I pat my dog, there's serotonin, and that's insane. That's actually the level of an insane man. But I think, one of the more important philosophers who I'm just really starting to get into on this would be, and I'm trying not to make this too complicated, but Wilfrid Sellers has the split of the images. So the manifest image, which is where we define things and we get our meaning as human beings from it, and the scientific image. And I think one thing that Hahn also alludes to in his work is that however you want to see these images or however you want to view them, we've begun either to synthesize them and think of ourselves as like from the scientific image as scientific creatures, or we've begun to conflate them. And notable psychiatrists do this, right? Where they say like, you're 7 on the openness chart, or you're 6 on the aggressive. It's absolute nonsense. But I think the same thing happens with pain, and it's a fear of the fear of pain is also a fear of losing control, and that sort of quantitative thinking gives us control, as if it's just chemicals, changes the experience that you're having in that moment. Just some comments, but it's mainly because I of all the supposed philosophical views, that is the one that I find the most destructive and the most just immature and insecure. It's a very insecure view. There you go.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that one of the through lines between the philosophers and thinkers that interest me the most, and also probably one of the reasons why I'm so interested in literature, is this non-reductiveness about the qualitative, I think, is really important. And somehow we've kind of flipped things to where we think that the qualitative is the artificial or the illusion. But, every inquiry begins in the qualitatively rich world. And then you enter the world of the microscope or the chart or the numerical abstraction. And it's always abstracted out of the qualitative. It's always literally secondary. And somehow we flipped it and think that that's primary. Certainly, I wouldn't say that there's not a layer of, and maybe an important layer of brain chemistry involved in mental struggles. I mean, I think, I've known people that have been helped a lot by that, but to reduce everything to that seems so misguided. And I actually think that often it's not psychologists and psychiatrists that do that reduction, at least in the United States. Often I think it's kind of primary care providers that are like, okay, you're struggling with depression, let me prescribe this. But all of human history, we know that losing loved ones, to come back to that example, is unavoidable. So we develop rituals, we develop practices, we develop a set of wisdom around those things. Doesn't make it easy per se, but it provides a way of trying to give some shape to that experience. And I think that that's important and not easily replaced. And I think we are suffering from the lack of that in a lot of ways in contemporary society. This is another point that Hahn has made across a number of his books, that the loss of a widely held Jewish and Christian narratives, the loss of that hasn't been emancipatory, or at least emancipatory alone, contra one set of kind of common assumptions. These things are just limiting, they hold people back, they restrict freedom, they're repressive. So when we get rid of these, we'll just be simply more free. One of the things that Hahn points out in this book is that, Christianity provides a narrative to help you deal with suffering. People might think it's a false narrative, but I think one of Hahn's points at the most basic level is that any narrative is better than no narrative in the end, if it helps you deal with it, and if it helps you deal with it in a non-reductive way. But I think he would go a good deal farther than that and say that beyond all the ways in which Christianity has taken saccharine forms, where it's just like, oh, you're going through a struggle, well, you'll just be fine because God's got you, God loves you, or that there can be a way within Christian circles or religious circles where you hear someone's struggling, you're just like, well, I'll just pray for you, right? That is very thin. But there's also a way in which it can be very thick, and a form of accompaniment, and kind of deeply meaningful and deeply serious on all these levels. And especially thinking about pain as that mystery that we inevitably will have to confront. Those are the kinds of things, kind of resources that Hahn suggests you need. And that we're very good at the technical dealing with the physical side of pain in some ways. There are things like the opioid crisis shows how all that can go awry. And he touches on that a little bit. But what we've lost is this way of sort of dealing with pain in a more holistic sense. Now, coming back to one of the first things you say, Hans overstates everything, right? And there's a way in which I think this is a rhetorical strategy on his part. He wants you to see the problem, so he puts it very strongly. You know, I think we've all encountered nurses and doctors, in my experience, more often nurses and doctors that are holistic, right? And treat you as a human. And I think we've all, could point to various parts of society where we're still doing this pretty well. I think a lot of hospice care can be really good, actually, in the United States, at least. So I can't speak more broadly. I don't know. This is, there are exceptions that I would at least want to note. But I think he's onto some real dynamics.
It's interesting that you mentioned the loss of ritual, and specifically using the Christian language. I mean, this goes back to the first point they were making about the elimination of pain and what to do with pain. And the specifically Christian notion of bearing your cross, which for Jesus Christ, of course, was to overcome sin and to die for the whole of humanity. But also this general notion of bearing your cross is inclusive of bearing the existential weight, but also bearing the weight of being an individual post the fall, right? You have to bear the fact of death and of pain and illness, which come from the loss of Eden and the loss of being one with God in Eden, and then from the fall. And so it's the case then it's no longer, it sort of moves through stages, I think, doesn't it? It's sort of initially it's you bear your cross, and it's an implicit understanding of not that is anything different. Pain and death are absolutely imminent and part of life. You take life and then they are part of it, and then it's bear your cross, but that which you bear, well, it's not that good. We shouldn't really have to do it. And then I think the worst thing is possibly to do is to try bastardize that in such a way within supposedly secular society where either you wish it to be that you can somehow not have the cross at all, or to transform the cross. And I think what a lot of it is transforming the cross in such a way that, oh no, see, look, it's not actually there, or these little tricks that we do. And that becomes more and more dangerous because you're delaying the inevitability of it. And so that's, the one way in which that ritual has changed. But I mean, I think we're talking around what's odd is that we're talking around something that is mandatory of existence. And so it's all a case of, well, sort of the day will come when you won't be, right? The day will come when pain will be there. The day will come when you will die. And so this strangeness of delay is delaying the inevitable, and it's it's doing much more than that. But unless you have a comment on what I said about Christianity, there is something I want to bring in because I do have a disagreement with Han.
Well, I would just add one little thing, is I think that any religion or philosophy from the ancient world that I know of, or with ancient roots, I should say, that I know of, provides ways of trying to deal with pain, right? Pain is a central part of it, a way of grappling with it. You brought up Buddhism earlier.
It's the first of the Four Noble Truths, right?
Yeah.
Life is suffering.
And I think that there's something really practical about that. And when you think about it, right, maybe it goes in sort of esoteric ways or things like that from there. But the starting point is just truly the human condition that we all must encounter. And I think that's noteworthy.
It's good that you mentioned human condition because it makes the segue less awkward. Because Han does emphasize, right? He says the pain is human. And I think being humans, whatever that is, I mean, that's a hot topic, is that actually, and this is where I disagree with Han, but as you say, he overplays everything, so I'm not sure if this is a full disagreement. I don't think we necessarily dislike pain. We dislike the factor of pain which is out of our control. And I think a lot of because immediately after reading The Palliative Society, I sat down and scrolled through it. I wanted to watch something while eating my dinner so I don't have to pay attention to either of the things. I immediately was scrolling through, films or whatever, and I thought, wow, these are all miserable. These are all ultimately full of pain. And then if you expand that idea out, I mean, it's not pain that we hate, it's pain that we don't have control of. I mean, I'll go watch the miserable film where people fall out of love or the character that they've forcibly made you like dies, or, I'll go do a bungee jump, or I will go, I weightlift, which ultimately that is me going to a place and quite literally applying a friction where there's multiple moments where it's uncomfortable or full of Han's definition of pain. And so it seems that we are living our sort of birthright of pain vicariously through basically empty activities. And they in a way replace, without sounding like some sort of pop philosopher, they replace that moment of sitting with your pain. They replace the Pascalian moment of sitting in the room quietly, right? The criticism, the friction, the tension that we can't deal with for Han, which he finds synonymous with pain, is like, every time we chat, I'll look at my phone, right? Like, I'm sitting with myself, I can't deal with this little bit of tension, I'm going to look at my phone and, dopamine, chemicals, there we go. I'm back to the quantitative, but there you go. So that's where I disagree with him, and I think we love pain, but it's become a drug.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. I think he would agree with at least part of that, though it's interesting to think about how much he'd have to reframe some of what he says in the Palliative Society. But certainly this desire for control is something that he would nod along to. So in this new book that's coming out, The Spirit of Hope, this is a central concern of his, because one of the things he wants to do is differentiate optimism from hope. So for him, and he's not the first to do this, though I think he does it in some really good ways. Terry Eagleton had a very similar book a few years ago called Hope Without Optimism. And Han quotes it, but I actually think this book is tighter and better in a lot of ways. And I like Eagleton. I don't mean that to be a great slam on him. But one of the things that Han says in The Spirit of Hope is that optimism is sure of where it's going. It's sure that a good outcome is coming, right? It might be hooked to a blithe or desperate form in progress, right? Like, technology will ultimately save us. When this political candidate gets elected, they'll save us. There's this very, it's hooked to a certain outcome, right? That it clings to. So there's an element of control there, to use your language, which I think is quite apt. Pessimism, he says, too, can be like that, right? It's like, we know it's going to shit. So in a way, acknowledging that
pessimism is an optimism.
Yeah, that's the the flip for him, right? For him, hope is a belief in kind of the openness and contingency of the future. And it doesn't deny that the problems are coming. It just denies that we know exactly how it's going to play out. It keeps a certain openness, a certain patience. And that patience, central to it, is this recognition that you don't have control. And patience, as he says a little bit in the Palliative Society and a lot in The Spirit of Hope, is kind of painful, right? You suffer it. You undergo patience. And we're not very good at that right now. It's always probably been hard, but we're not very good at it. But I think he would say that in that space of patience, there's an openness where, a truer encounter might happen with all kinds of things.
I mean, I don't want to fully. One thing I want to touch on in a bit is the neutrality of pain, because I think that's really important as to why we one of the control aspects, especially within our society. But there's something I want to say just before that, just on this notion of not liking pain or not wanting it, is I just want to drag in Freud and a little bit of Lacan just to complexify it, because, I'm in England, like I'm not a huge football fan, but when the World Cup and the Euros come around, of course I support England. It's an easy thing to do. It's good fun, right? But England can't win. Not literally. I'm sure they could. I'm sure at some point maybe they will. But when, to change the Lacan quote, when my wife is late, she's no longer my wife. When England win, they're no longer England. Right? We adore that pain of coming second or coming third or whatever it might be, of losing in the quarterfinals or losing to penalties. And when that doesn't happen, it's almost like it's going to be the ultimate disappointment. When England winning is going to be the ultimate disappointment, because the pain that we sort of love to feel in that sort of frustration or whatever is no longer going to be there. And you see this with everything. I'm sure maybe there's probably an underdog you support somewhere in your life that unconsciously there's this because if they win, then next season is kind of gone now, and I just got to move on. And so everything is replaced with a pain that is within competition and within things like that. And I think everywhere in society you can look and you can find these unconsciously desired failures, which is a form of pain that is in our control. But the problem is it has no risk. There's no real cost to the actual failure. But I think we absolutely, this is, Han would say pain is human. And this is my point here, is that, yeah, we get rid of all the biological pain. We're really good on paracetamol and aspirin and anesthesia and anesthetic society. But you can't just push something down without it coming back up somewhere else. And I think with, in Freudian sense, it would be, I got rid of all that biological pain. Right now I'm going to go support England and have another panic attack every year when we inevitably get through the penalties, but I love it. So, I think pain is human in the sense that you absolutely have to have that, because otherwise, yeah, I get up and everything I do is perfect. That's going to be an awful life. So you have to have pain. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's just fantastic in all kinds of ways. And I do think there's a bit here where you're pointing out how the overstatement of Han can obscure the ways in which, yeah, we do still experience and in a way value certain kinds of pain. I think that in general, athletics is one of the places where pain is sort of most recognized as having at least a potential upside in our society. I think the idea that you got to make progress through struggle is sort of most readily accepted in athletics. But then coming more to your specific example, Han's notion of hope isn't far removed from a certain kind of pessimism. I think that's important, right? So, I think that kind of what you're describing in one way, it might seem strange, but there is a kind of hope that binds together England fans, right?
Absolutely.
It's not the optimism that if you're, I don't know, what would be Italy or something like that.
You have this Italy or Brazil final or something, right? They're both going to be optimistic because they're bloody good teams.
Yeah, and there's something kind of thinner about that, right? Because you don't have that element of negativity in it where that there are all these kind of likely bad ends that are going to happen. And Han also says that hope, that kind of hope, binds people together into a we, right? And so what is the fan of a struggling team than one that lives bound by this somewhat pessimistic hope? But it binds you more tightly together in a way than if you won all the time. So I don't know. I think there is a mix of good correctives to Han in what you say, but also some overlap with some of the ways that he thinks about hope and the patience it involves and the kind of tough-mindedness about it.
Yeah.
But the last thing that you bring up that he doesn't really bring up that I think is so fascinating is that there are certain kind of hopes that if they were fully satisfied, thered be a loss in a way, because the tension of living in hope might be richer than actually winning, and to some extent.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a catharsis, it would be a flattening. It might be a catharsis within certain context, right? If you've been an England fan your whole life and then the last ever World Cup you watch before your death or something, right? That might work on a contextual.
It would be pretty satisfying, probably.
Right, but only within that minor context. Or I don't know, or something would happen. But there's just another aspect I have to bring in. It was just because I've had this conversation with Todd McGowan most recently on alienation and embracing alienation, which is really embracing the frictions and pain within our life. This also is beginning to happen with media, right? So have you seen Breaking Bad?
Yeah.
Right. So Todd McGowan, anyone who hasn't seen Breaking Bad, I'm sorry, but you should. It's amazing.
You really should.
So, but Todd McGowan makes a point. He says Breaking Bad should have ended when Hank found out on the toilet. That should have been when the series ended, right? That would have given us that productive pain. But what did they do? We get the closure for Walt, and then we just have enough pain with Jesse and not knowing that we imagine. Same with like the end of The Sopranos. The reason the ending of The Sopranos is so incredible is because it's painful. Like, you mean I don't get to know? Like, but what did Breaking Bad do? They went and did another series, and then they went and did the Jesse ending. And so, you're a bit of pain. Bit of pain will alleviate that, and it's pain. The pain is resolved from knowing, right? Like you have full. And a lot of other shows do this where they go back in time. So you have a character like Hannibal Lecter was a classic example. Like, how did this guy get built? Where did he come from? Oh, we'll do young Hannibal, right? So the pain of not knowing as well. Everything is beginning to get resolved, but it ends up not in. It's like England winning. It doesn't end in a catharsis. It ends in like, oh, all right, like you're just bored, and then you go on to the next thing. So. But I think maybe this is because pain, like just to bring in the next point I wanted to bring in, it's because pain is neutral. Like we think the resolution of the pain will do something that we apply to pain, some positive or negative, but pain is completely neutral. And in like a Foucault, we're homo politicus, homo economicus now, where everything has some quantitative thing. Pain is a weird rupture where it's like, it doesn't have a relationship to anything. And I love the title for this, right? Like Pain Today, Palliative Society, the second part, Pain Today, as if pain has changed. So what do you think about this neutrality? Do you think that's why the control problem is as well?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I might have to think more about that
Steve,
to have
throwing so much at you.
To have anything intelligent to say. I think that if I follow your point, I half agree. But I think that what Han's really getting at is that the context of pain and the understanding of pain is what shifts. And I think there's probably something to that. Pain itself, its neutrality, it's interesting to think about, right? Because I mean, I guess it depends on how much we can separate the pain from the context of it, right? So certainly when you don't have to go back far in history. My granddad, one was a coal miner and one was a farmer. Probably they both lived with a lot more day-to-day aches and pains than I do. Probably also they were a lot less afflicted, or they were a lot less, they were kind of tougher to a lot of those, right? So, if I go out and dig holes for the day, I'm going to be feeling it for a week. I don't think that was true of my granddad, right? Not to over romanticize that, because, you also get like lung disease and all kinds of horrible things from being a coal miner. But I think that Han's point is that sort of where we are vis-a-vis pain and sort of the assumptions we bring to it are going to interact at least with that neutrality of pain.
Okay. Do you think there is a direct relationship between pain and death? Because after reading this book, I thought about it for a while, and I don't think there is. I don't think it's as immediately obvious as we'd think it is, that you think, oh, I'm in pain. So, one very sort of quick argument one might make and reasoned, and it seems rational, is that like we're Darwinian creatures. We are ultimately, and our base level desire is to survive. So when we feel pain, we're like, that's interacting with my survival, and I don't want to die, right? There seems to be, in some levels, some inherent relationship between pain and death. But after I read this book and began to think about pain, it seems that what pain does is basically just say, I don't want to be in pain. I don't think it has that much relationship to death. Because that would be like the Ernest Becker point, right? Like the denial of pain is also denial of death, but I don't see that now.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. I mean, there's the pain of fearing death. I think that that's a thing. And maybe that's part of what Han's talking about in places. But this is one of the downsides of writing these short books that cover so much territory quickly, and sometimes without truly marking the movement from sort of one angle approach to another. So, yeah, I think there's a lot more room for clarity about where death fits into this. Now, I will say that one of Han's best books that hasn't been translated into English is called Death and Alterity. And I think that's a really fascinating book in where he argues that kind of a certain death obsession in Western philosophy leads us to sort of cling more tightly to the ego, and that's kind of like a mutually reinforcing bad loop.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we kind of release the ego, right, that's where sort of in one of his more Zen stages of his career, if you got to release the ego, then death sort of loses this ominous hold.
Well, there's no me to die.
Yeah, and you sort of open up into, a more less constricted, claustrophobic way of being in the world as a result of that. So it'd be interesting for him to sort of come back to some of that in a book like The Palliative Society or The Spirit of Hope. But that's also a book I hope gets translated at some point, because I think it's very substantial. It's much longer than most of his books.
Mm. So right at the end of the book, we have this short dialogue on Fukuyama, on the last man, and the end of history, where Han basically states that the last man is not really got anything to do with, specifically to do with liberal democracy. This is just the modern man. And the modern man of Fukuyama is Nietzsche's The Last Man. And that last man has an implicit relationship with avoidance of pain. And I think in that, related to that, is in avoiding pain, it's interesting to think about that, what, chicken or the egg, but in avoiding pain, there is an implication of, I should then be going to happen. Like, I avoid pain that way, which means I should go to happiness that way. And I wonder that's a chicken egg situation. What comes first, going after the happiness or realizing you should avoid pain?
Well, one of the things that comes out in that last chapter that you touch on is, unlike Junger, who we started talking about all at the beginning, Han is a democratic thinker, not an anti-democratic thinker. He sees his project as trying to renew democracy, among other things. And I think that he does that in some ways, like someone like Chantal Mouffe, by taking sort of certain, often seen as illiberal things that are actually necessary to the health of democracy, right? That have to be sort of incorporated into it, like agonism, right? The dialectic of hard argument about issues with real back and forth, right? That's one thing, and the pain that's involved in that. But then this book also is born out of the pandemic, and that's a whole can of worms. I just probably had COVID a couple weeks ago, and test came back negative, but it sort of seemed like it, and it was pretty miserable, right? So COVID was a real thing. A lot of people died from it. It was bad. It was a real pandemic and threat. But Han, I think, and I think I agree with him, is interested in sort of the various stages of overreaction to COVID in the later stages, where the approaches to try to manage it had actually been discredited as good approaches. Keeping schools locked down and kids out of schools for so long, we're still dealing with that. And I think now it's pretty uncontroversial to say that was a bad idea. Well, guess what? We kind of knew that while the pandemic was still going on in its later stages, and we persisted. Han also points to, closing of churches for so long, keeping family and chaplains and things like that from the deathbed, right? Reducing death to like the barest of life. These are all, we lost the good life for the bare life. And, one of the things he says in that last chapter is that if you elevate safety and health above freedom to such a degree, then the last man is anti-democratic and anti-liberal, right? Because you're basically asking for rigid and authoritarian approaches that will supposedly keep you safe.
Well, no, I wanted to add this in because it aligns with Hans' work on ritual, but as you mentioned, the COVID, this strange contradictory point of, a lot of people say like abide by the science, and yet we've abided by the science to put this measure in, and now during it, the science is saying, well, actually, no, this won't really do anything. So it was in that moment I thought of the book We Have Never Been Modern, right, by Bruno Latour, where he's saying that we have these grand signifiers, society, economy, whatever it might be, that we abide by as our sort of new gods in the so-called secular society. And I think one of them is maybe not specifically healthcare in terms of institution, but healthcare in a Han way of we can eliminate pain. And so I think the reversal of those measures is Hanian in the sense of it's a heresy, right? Like it doesn't matter if it's wrong, it's a heresy against because to do that would basically say we tried our best, we actually can't control, like there's nothing we can do, which is like not what you want. It's like going to a doctor and he says, we don't, like imagine if your doctor said we don't know, which they never say, do they? Doctors always have like a way of, well, we'll run these more tests or blah, blah, blah. And to hear we don't know, I think actually is really important because it then opens you up into a new form of sovereignty and friction, I think, like an existential, oh, okay, like you don't know, fine. And I think that's what that moment was we just really are, we really don't like saying, we're all out of ideas, like we're all out of ideas. It's a tantamount to heresy against, you guess what, you're going to be in pain, like that's life.
No, and kind of the tragic lose-lose situation, right? We really weren't prepared to deal with a situation that no matter what path we take, there's going to be risks and trade-offs and negative outcomes, and sort of becoming fixated on the threat of the virus as the only risk that matters. In certain situations, like to come back to schooling, where the risk was never very high at all, thankfully, for little kids, bracketing all kinds of other, bad things you're subjecting them to in the name of this, we're trying to fixate on reducing this one risk to as close to zero as we can. And I think that's kind of goes back to sort of come full circle to Hans' concern that if we reduce pain just to something that has to be eliminated and can be eliminated, right? And especially that second thing, the idea that it can be fully eliminated, then you're going to sort of not think clearly about the situation because guess what? It can't be fully eliminated.
Yeah, I mean, and it's already apparent that those 2 or 3 year gap is, I think it's going to become a sort of certain generation in time called the COVID. I've got friends with little kids who's, phonetics and especially language learning is when your brain is plastic in that era, it really takes a hit. And there's a lot of struggle for those young kids to catch up now. It's sort of kind of astounding to see what happens when you just say, right, it's 2 years. And just as an aside, one of the things I think that people are seeing a lot is, I guess, over-attachment to parents. So, you have a child who's really young and in this stage where the world is still very new, I guess, and the only human beings they interacted with properly for 1-2 years was these two people. It's a strange thing to put any being through, and all of a sudden the world becomes, I guess, scarier, etc., etc. So, yeah, it's an odd testament to what Han is writing about.
Very unfortunate. And Han, during the midst of the pandemic, he was never, I think, as much of a lightning rod in these things as like Agamben was during the, but I think, expressed some of the same concerns in maybe a little more measured way. But at one point, he had kind of a low grade public controversy where Zizek was saying that the pandemic was going to do in capitalism, and Han was like, no way. This is just going to strengthen capitalism. Right. And I mean, just think about how it increased the hold of Amazon or something like that. I mean, it really, I think that he was spot on about that too. Or the ways that we've now learned all kinds of ways to try to get people to do more work at home through, the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, again, hindsight's 2020, and I think that there has to be a lot of grace for those early periods where people are trying to figure it out. But I think in hindsight, there was a lot of distortions, and there was a lot of kind of failures to think reasonably about these things.
Mm. Is there anything you'd like to add about palliative society that we haven't touched upon? The feel is key.
No, I think we covered it pretty well. I mean, the only thing I might re-underline, because I just love that chapter so much, is the one about thinking, where he takes a quote from Hegel that says that thinking involves pain because you have to deal with contradiction. And I think that's really true, especially in something like philosophy. There's no way to think through a thorny issue without struggle, but that's also important. I think that's true of another subject that I was never very good at all and kind of gave up on the struggle, but like mathematics. I think that there's these ways in which the hardest, most worthy things to deal with, I'd say like poetry too is kind of this way. They take, you have to sort of tarry with them. You have to tarry on uncertainty and contradiction, and persist. And there is like a struggle and a pain there. And I think that's just an important thing.
There's also, I think there's a pain of limitation there, because there's, I was okay at maths. I'm trying to think, for some reason, my brain doesn't gel well with geography, like at all, for some reason, whatever it might be. And same probably applies for people with maths or whatever it might be. And so there's that pain of that sort of empty space where like you're looking at the numbers, or for my case, trying to figure out where countries are or whatever it might be. And like your biological limitations, which are painful, is like, you don't get to do this. And the same applies, when you brought the athlete example in, however hard I tried, if I wanted to, I'm not going to be Usain Bolt, because it's a biological limitation. So there's that pain of, maths and poetry is a good example, but that pain of, I just can't, this isn't a thing that I get to do. And I think that applies to that criticism angle of trying to find a way for a sort of a neutralizing of all pain into a sort of just this soup where nothing has any potency. I mean, it's apt that Hegel says reading philosophy is painful. I mean, come on,
my one colleague has a great meme that's like a normal headache, a migraine, it's getting brighter, and then like reading Hegel, and it's like your head's exploding. So there is some truth to that. Yeah. He wanted to make sure that reading him was good and extra painful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say the same about Schopenhauer is on the other hand at the same time. So
yeah, it's funny. Schopenhauer is much more the thinker of pain, but his prose is
just very simple,
lively. Yeah,
very simple, very fun. Yeah. What do you think the future of pain is?
Oh goodness, I mean, that's a hard one. And having just read Han's new book on hope, I think I would say that it's a little hard to prognosticate where some of these things are going. But I think a lot of the movements in more sort of post-human directions, a lot of the stuff around kind of radical anti-aging, a lot of that is relevant to this. And I think that there is a certain naivete or utopianism around a lot of it. I think, and the other thing is that to touch a really controversial subject of euthanasia. I mean, I think that when we have such a distorted relationship to pain, and already, like, when we marginalize the elderly so much in our society, I mean, I don't think we're in a mature place to sort of have this conversation.
Absolutely, it's the terrifying thing of the day, and I think it does have to be added into this conversation, because euthanasia as an event, and as you step into this pod, we press a button, certain gas or whatever it might be, and you're dead. The implication there, especially when it's chronic pain, or people are really struggling to live, is absolutely the solidification of the implication that pain is, at that point, just an error. Literal existence should not be, as per the logic of killing someone, literal existence, existing as a human being, should not include pain of a certain level. But I think also it's undoubtable that one of the larger worries, because if someone's absolutely suffering with the worst chronic pain imaginable, I think most people can sympathize with wanting to do that in a let's say an orderly fashion, where you're not doing it yourself in some horrible way. But I think the more worrying implication that most people have cottoned onto is this notion of, once you're out of the productivity quantitative loop and you're no longer a productive member, is that what we're now consigning human beings to be? Like, if you're not a productive scientific image human being who is working or whatever, then your existence is fruitless, and there will be reason to be found that you should just be killed. And this is clearly already making its way into the news. And I think it's sort of a very morbid version of, you invent the car, you invent the car crash, you invent euthanasia, you invent all the justifications and logic behind euthanasia. And yeah, that's not going to be a good good future, but it's sort of the generations that are the least ready to deal with a serious amount of pain are going to have to deal with a serious amount of pain. Antibiotic resistance, global warming.
Yeah,
but we're already seeing global weighting everywhere. Yeah. Hope, though.
Yeah, and that might be for another conversation. It's funny because my one buddy always writes about pessimism, and I always write about hope. But I often feel like we're not actually that far apart.
No. Well, oh yeah, that seems like a good place to finish up. Are you working on anything right now?
So I'm trying to wrap up this edited collection of essays about William Desmond, who you kindly had me on the show to talk about before, and his William Desmond in literature. So I'm working on that. Just teaching. I'm in the middle of the semester, and yeah, it's about where I'm at.
It's good. It's good to hear. I look forward to chatting with you about William Desmond in literature. Steve Knepper, once again, thanks very much.
Thanks again for having me, James.